the old-fashioned right-wing thing would have been rise above it. And the current one is, we tried that, so let's decide to get down and dirty and into the gutter as well.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Kate Andrews, the Spectator's U.S. Deputy Editor, and I'm joined by Spectator columnist Douglas Murray. Douglas, in your column for the magazine this week, you talk about the issue that is probably causing the most tension and disruption between Donald Trump and his most fervent supporters. It's not the impact of the tariffs. It's not even foreign policy, really. It's the Jeffrey Epstein files. Do tell us more.
Yes, well, as you mentioned, Kate, as I write about in my column, the president is obviously pretty irritated at the moment because whenever he's asked about the Epstein case, or has been in recent days, he sort of says, well, why aren't we talking about trade? Why aren't we talking about all the successes in the country? And so on. And so he really clearly doesn't want the agenda to be dominated by a man who died 6 years ago now. But it does keep coming back, and I think it will keep coming back because everything around the Epstein affair just sort of bubbles away. There's an enormous amount that we, the public, still do not know. There have been, over the years, the decades, as you know, and people watching will know, many prominent people who've been tied up with Jeffrey Epstein. And of course, Donald Trump said on the campaign trail for re-election that he would look into releasing all the remaining files, information, and so on about Epstein. Not much more than a month after his return to office, the White House held a sort of rather strange jamboree, it has to be said, where some conservative influencers and others were handed what was called the Epstein Files, Volume 1, and sort of left the White House waving them like they'd got the golden tickets to Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, only then to discover that everything that was in this Volume 1 was already publicly available. But of course it meant that people said, well, where's Volume 2, 3, whatever else? Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, helped sort of fuel that by saying that she had the Epstein client list on her desk, ready to go, only to then, in recent weeks, reverse on that and say, as others in the administration have, that there is no such thing as the client list. And currently, the administration has this problem, which is that the story around Epstein and what we don't know, and some of the more lurid conspiracy theories about it, and just theories. I mean, we shouldn't tarnish everything by saying it's conspiracy theory. Some of the more lurid theories around it have been fueled by people who are now in the administration, people at the FBI, CIA, Trump appointees, as well as the Attorney General and perhaps Trump himself. And so to now say, there's just nothing to see here, obviously hasn't in any way convinced the people who members of this administration were previously speaking to.
The president shared on Truth Social last night, we had the greatest 6 months of any president in the history of our country, and all the fake news wants to talk about is the Jeffrey Epstein hoax. I'm always baffled by where he places capital letters, but he is also baffled by why there is so much attention and emphasis on these files when, as you say, Douglas, he wants to be talking about just about anything else that he's doing in the administration at the moment. But part of the difficulty is that it's something that he said he would do, release these files. It was part of the campaign promise. He's been making good, for better or worse, on other parts of what he promised on the campaign trail. So it sticks out that he's not making good on this one. And of course, as you say, people around him, but Donald Trump himself hyped up this issue. His base, understandably, may be confused as to why they have decided it is no longer an issue, with essentially little to no explanation.
That's right. I mean, saying that he would, look into releasing the information about Jeffrey Epstein was a sort of relatively easy thing to say on the campaign trail. But of course, but he also said that he would release the remaining files about the JFK assassination, the RFK assassination, and the Martin Luther King assassination. And he's done a lot of that. There was a huge dump of what seemed to be all the remaining files, of government files relating to the JFK assassination. It was released a couple of months into the administration. I wrote about that in the Spectator at the time, if you remember, and said, that one of the interesting things about this was that, and this is of course about a historic case which doesn't have any of it certainly doesn't have the same potency as the Epstein case. But the historic case of the JFK files, Trump had said, and others had said, this is going to be huge. And actually, there was nothing in the files so far as historians have been able to find so far that really changes in any significant way the story that Lee Harvey Oswald shot the president and was acting alone. There were some operational details about the CIA tracking Lee Harvey Oswald's movements and so on that hadn't been released before. But otherwise, there was effectively nothing new. So expectations have been raised and then slightly dashed, I suppose. But that's on a historic case. The thing with the Epstein thing that's so lethal is that there are so many people in significant positions in American public life and indeed internationally who were involved with Jeffrey Epstein. And the thing is, as I say in the column this week, is that there are lots of very tricky corners here. There is the undoubted fact that Jeffrey Epstein was convicted for, among other things, sex with underage girls, trafficking, and so on. And then there are several sort of categories, as it were, that you could put people into, which is, who was he effectively working as some kind of high-end pimp for? Which is the expectation of what the so-called client list would be if it exists. And again, there's been some dispute about that. Secondly, who was involved, like Epstein, in sex with minors. And then third, and this is where it's sort of maybe it's the sort of hardest corner, is that who are the people who Epstein simply, in his extraordinary networking habits, whatever drove them, who were the people simply who came into the orbit of Epstein and never did anything that was illegal or improper? And Trump has said in recent days that that he wanted to be careful that the people in the third group, for people who have just had, for instance, been at a party with Jeffrey Epstein or had his hospitality without any, accusations of illegal behavior or anything like that. Trump said he wanted to make sure that people who are innocent didn't just have their reputations completely, shattered by being named or identified in a massive sort of data dump of everything that's known about Epstein. And that's of course that is a reasonable and responsible attitude to take about it. But the fact that all these years later, so little has been made publicly known about those first two categories of people involved with either sex with people who are of legal age but may have been trafficked, and those who are underage. The fact that so little of that has come out after all of these years, I think understandably does bewilder a lot of members of the public. And of course, the problem of this stage is that if you just try to pass over the whole thing, I think people aren't going to be persuaded by that. And certainly the part of the Trump base and others who have really been fed a lot of speculation as fact are going to be disappointed. But in a way, as I mentioned in the column also, all of this does feed into some very deep feelings of the public. I mean, there's the understandable outrage at the idea that anyone in public life would have been involved in sex with minors. And then there's this sort of thing of, and I mentioned the column, of course, we in Britain, not much over a decade ago, underwent a totally fictitious scandal like this or related to this, when a fantasist claimed that there had been a paedophile sex ring in Westminster. And those of us who followed that story and wrote about it at the time you could tell it just didn't pass any smell tests. The idea that politicians in Westminster and leaders of the army and so on, often who hated each other, had disagreed on everything but sort of secretly raped and murdered children in private, didn't seem particularly believable. But it was interesting how much that caught on when irresponsible actors like Labour's Tom Watson decided to push this and run with this, what turned out to be a completely wild conspiracy theory. The Epstein thing is different from that, because there's the long catalogue of his own states' legal actions against him. So it's not like the Epstein thing is a conspiracy theory, but there are certainly conspiracies now around it, and some of which I think, as I mentioned in the piece, people have really got ahead of their skis on some of this. I mean, there are prominent commentators in the US who are saying that, as a matter of fact, they know that Epstein was some kind of intelligence asset for foreign governments, intelligence agency, or others. And, were that to be the case, it should come out. But at the moment, a lot of people are asserting that that's the case, actually without any evidence to say it is, other than just speculation. So the challenge for the administration is, how do you satisfy the expectations of people with reasonable concerns that we don't know things we should know about Epstein, and at the same time not fall into releasing a massive amount of information that could wreck the lives of completely innocent people?
Douglas, a part of your column that I found quite compelling is when you're talking about how mistrustful the public is of the state, of the government, of elites, of the people who rule them. And many of them are just waiting for some kind of awful, atrocious, unthinkable scandal
Yes.
to come out. What does it say about the state of US politics, but perhaps politics across the West, that so many members of the public could start to go down these rabbit holes and really come to believe some of these more radical theories around the Epstein files, or plenty of the other theories that float around government? It's not just the Epstein files. We can get into some of those in a little bit. What does it say about the state of politics in America and elsewhere, that the public are so ready to at some point be informed that something atrocious and unthinkable has happened amongst the people who make the rules and make the decisions for them and govern them?
It's a very good question. I mean, something I've written about quite a lot in recent years has been the complete breakdown of trust in all institutions. I mentioned during the interregnum, the Trump interregnum, that if you look at the way in which the American right has in recent years taken on not just criticisms, but sort of burn it down attitudes towards institutions in America. If you look at that there is something profoundly disconcerting about that. You see it in the UK and, frankly, most other Western democracies as well. And the issue is mainly one of the fact that it's not like people are onto nothing with their distrust of certain institutions. We have seen the politicization of the CIA and the FBI. Trump supporters watched as government agencies acted against a sitting president. And so there is this instinct, I suppose, which the left always has as well, which is, if the institution isn't fully transparent or has done something untoward, then we should burn the whole thing down. That's tended to be a sort of more of a left-wing instinct in recent decades. But partly thanks to the repeated attempts to persecute Donald Trump during his first term, spying on the campaign and much more, this is migrated to the right as well. And the problem then is, if you don't just have criticisms of the FBI, CIA, and so on, but actually believe that they are working against America. And if you do that on institution after institution, the courts, Supreme Courts, and so on, you really aren't in a position of being conservative in any recognizable way, because the conservative instinct should be to reform and rebuild institutions when they err and stray, not to destroy them, to rebuild trust rather than just abolish things you don't like. And the problem in the US is I think is more acute than anywhere, because people have seen, from both political sides, have seen government agencies and bodies doing things which are unjustifiable. And then into that, if you throw things like a majority of the American public in recent years have agreed that with the statement that, for instance, Lee Harvey Oswald didn't act alone in the assassination of JFK. If you end up believing as a mainstream opinion that, for instance, a US government agency had the ability to murder a sitting US president and get away with it, well, I mean, like, what if they can do that, they can do anything. Right? No one's safe.
Well, all bets are off. Yeah.
I mean, I made this point in March in my column about the JFK files. Same things with the RFK assassination, MLK, and so on. But it's also, I think, what we're seeing is something in real time, which I've also written about in the past in the magazine, which is what I call the problem of the second dark age. The first dark age in Europe was characterized by total inability to access information, knowledge, books, anything really. And the second dark age, which I've suggested we might be in at the moment, is one in which we have such overwhelming quantities of information that it's very hard for people to know how to parse it, how to review it, how to understand it. And that's the case. I mean, the Epstein thing is just absolutely ripe for this moment, because, for instance, there are accounts that when the police raided Epstein's home in Palm Beach, they found files, discs, videotapes, and so on, which with people's names on them, that suggested that Epstein was indeed collecting sort of compromat, blackmail material, either for financial gain or, as some people have suggested, on behalf of some intelligence agency. But if that is the case, and that claim has been put out there a lot, then it's understandable if people say, well, why don't we know who these people are? If there are people who have been high up in public life in America, including the allegation against the sitting president, but also previous presidents, members of the royal family, lawyers, senior financial figures, and so on, if it is the case that Epstein had compromat on large numbers of very prominent people, it's understandable the general public would want to know who those people were, let alone if they had also committed crimes. And so then it's very hard to sort of say, well, it's okay, there's nothing to see here, because the evidence of some, how many years, 18 years or so now, of information about Epstein since he was first charged in Florida, there must be an overwhelming quantity of information, materials from his house, and much more that are clearly in the public interest. And it's understandable the public would want to know what exactly is being hidden here.
And I wonder if the public are more in tune with these points now since the pandemic, because of course, and in America, I think the debate was much larger and much more intense perhaps than it was in parts of Europe. Your average person started being accused of being a conspiracy theorist if they questioned whether or not the virus came from a wet market in China. And anybody who questioned whether or not this was lab-made, potentially lab-made, was branded in such an extreme and often public way as being a crazy person. And so to talk about conspiracy theories now, to talk about radical theories, it's a little more personal post-pandemic than perhaps it was before. It used to be contained, usually, not always, to a very elite, very particular group of people who were untouchable in so many ways. And that was part of the interest, because all of a sudden they were exposed.
Yes.
But now when we talk about these theories, I wonder if people feel a bit more personally about them. And I wonder if that is also one of the reasons that the MAGA base is so frustrated with the person that they have been supporting for years now, at his highs and at his lows. that they almost feel like the person who helped them call out conspiracy
Yes.
previously during the pandemic in their minds is now
Yes.
the person who's pulling the shade down.
Yeah, that's it's very pertinent. This how much of this is a sort of post-COVID thing, or at least the whole COVID era exacerbated this. Because as you say, I mean, the COVID era, we saw things that were called conspiracy theories, which a year or two later are conceded as being what we used to call facts, and for that to
Hmm.
happen in real time like that is bound to have an effect on trust and whether or not we, the public, are being told things that are true by people in charge. And that, I mean, that, as I've said in the past about the COVID pandemic, that's particularly lethal because, of course, you could pretty much agree by 2020 that if we've been told, stay in your houses, everyone, and don't meet your loved ones even when they're dying because academics say so, people would not have stayed in their houses. If you said you've got to stay in your houses, the journalists say so. And people would not have
No one
stayed in
would
their
stay in
houses.
their
Politicians say so, no. But if you say the scientists, the science
house.
says so, well, that's different. People still believed, and I think with understandable reasons, believed the science. And that, in a way, was what I've described as the fall of the last cathedral, which is that then this profound suspicion of science and scientists was added to the profound suspicion of every other institution, every other discipline and realm of public life, and so on. And by the way, that also goes back to the Epstein thing, because one of Epstein's clear sort of modus operandi was that he did, through his rather, I mean, still unexplained. I mean, there's a lot of things that are Epstein about unexplained sources of wealth, unexplained connections. But what does seem to be the case is, for whatever reasons, he, among other things, did involve himself in philanthropy and so on with the world of science, academia in the US in particular, a lot of scientists in the US and the UK and elsewhere that he got close to. So that also sort of, is a question that is pertinent to this. It's like, because this guy seemed to have got absolutely everywhere, and seemed to have known absolutely everyone. There are people, and it's worth mentioning that there are people who simply came across Epstein in the same way that you might if you're in certain political or celebrity circles, or in his case in academic circles as well, that would just meet him, have pitched something to him as an idea for philanthropic investment and so on, who have spent years being besmirched and who have done nothing wrong. But that's part of this, what I described earlier, is this thing of the need to sort of separate out exactly what's going on here. Who the people were that Epstein simply wanted to be close to because he seemed to like, networking, connecting with people, and maybe, or quite likely, quite a lot more, including compromising people. But then who were the people he tried that with that it didn't work? And I can think of a number. I've spoken to a number. And then, of course, who were the people he tried that with and it did work? And that's the sort of thing that the public want to know. But it's because there are so many people involved in the case who are still alive, very active in public life, and much more so, anything which actually involved a sort of data dump like the release of the remaining JFK files, anyone involved in that would have to use a scalpel to make sure, as the president has said, that innocent people don't have their reputations trashed without having done anything wrong. And then, of course, who the people are who are mentioned in the files, or whom Jeffrey Epstein collected material on, who it is in the public interest to know if they were in some way compromised or blackmailed by this man.
Douglas, lastly, I want to ask you how the president is responding to all this. So he is addressing it head on, as he is doing on Truth Social and in some comments to reporters, but he's also certainly trying to pivot to other theories, particularly looking at Russiagate and the fact that the first 2-3 years of his first term in the Oval Office were dominated
Yeah.
by accusations that he and the Russian government had stolen the election. He's also been pivoting to his own theories about the 2020 election, reasserting in recent days that he won it and he won it big. And he's pointing his finger at others, including now former President Barack Obama, and he's resurfacing the name Hillary Clinton, and he's talking about jail time. He's talking about going after them and the people around them for what he considered to be illegal and aggressive behavior. I'm interested by the use of lawfare here. I'll admit personally to being slightly horrified by it. Is it not interesting that Donald Trump, who knows firsthand the horrible realities of lawfare and what happens when you're targeted for who you are, than perhaps opposed to what you did, is deciding to now weaponize that in a big way now that he's back in power? I mean, Donald Trump
Yeah.
actually could, if he wanted to, probably bring a lot of this to an end, draw a line under it and say, we're not doing this anymore. But instead, he's ramping it up. Do you think that this pivot's going to work? Do you think that emphasis on other major political players is going to help divert the attention away from himself? Or is this just going to see every theory, including the Epstein theories, spiral further out of his control?
Well, the interesting thing is that part of the Trump base, the MAGA supporters, they really, I think it's important that people realize that outside of America in particular, that during rallies in the lead up to the 2016 election, of course, Donald Trump often had at rallies the chant started, or he encouraged, about Hillary Clinton, lock her up. And when he came into office, rather to the surprise of a lot of people, as you'll remember at the time, when he came into office, he decided to take a much more magnanimous view about that and decided it was not appropriate to in any way pursue, prosecute, persecute former Secretary of State, former senator, and so on. And even if he could have done, he decided to draw a line under it. A lot of MAGA supporters, a lot of Trump's base say, well, the president showed magnanimity after victory, but the Democrats did not by any means demonstrate magnanimity in defeat. And when Trump brings back the Russia hoax, which, as you say, I mean, it bogged down that first Trump term to an extraordinary extent. A lot of the president's agenda was not able to be fulfilled because his time was being deliberately filled up, having to bat back these endless attempts at impeachment and so on. And if you consider the fact that, there are things like, I mean, here's one that's, very fervent on the American right. Look at the one of the 51 intelligence or ex-intelligence officials who signed the letter saying that the Hunter Biden laptop, when it was released in 2020, was a hoax. It seemed to have the hallmarks of Russian disinformation. Those 51 former intelligence officers were wrong. And there's a question among a lot of Trump's base, which is, how come there are all these ex-spooks who could sign a letter like that, saying that something they hadn't seen had the hallmarks of a Russian hoax, when in actual fact, it was Hunter Biden's laptop? Now, that might seem a rather, recondite point to make, but actually it wasn't, because this was at a close fought election in 2020 that these people made this highly political intervention. And then a lot of Trump supporters are like, well, how come they keep doing things that are demonstrably pushing either disinformation or hoaxes, and how come they keep getting away with it? And then the question comes up, like, why is our side so full of mugs that we keep being magnanimous to people who are not magnanimous towards us? That's a very understandable sentiment on the American right, and people have to remember that. I mean, it wasn't just Donald Trump they came for in his first term and since. There were attempts to get his family members. Again, you might say, well, look at the way in which Hunter Biden was gone after by Republicans. Yes, but it's a reminder that this is extremely personal now in American politics. But I do think that question of, the old-fashioned right-wing thing would have been rise above it. And the current one is, we tried that, so let's decide to get down and dirty and into the gutter as well. And that may be a tactical, that may well prove to be tactically the right thing to do. But you can't say that attempted prosecutions of former presidents, any more than acting presidents, is something that can lead to anywhere good for the unity of the United States of America.
Indeed. Douglas Murray, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you.